BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett. Episode 1. Spring. The kitten's eyes are just on the cusp of changing from blue to green. In the tiny, blurred square of a video, she stands apart from her baby siblings, all of whom are wrestling. In contrast, she is still, with a worried-looking expression on her face. She looks like a mix of every cat going, a tortoiseshell with flashes of white on her forehead, bib, and feet. My husband has already said he likes her the best. I send the video to my friend Jacob. The existential-looking one in the corner, he types. Yes, she's the one. What is it about a cat's face that makes it so lovable? Experts have suggested that their features remind us of babies' countenances. The cat-worshipping internet calls cats fur babies, a phrase that I would rather die than ever use, but perhaps this hints at some truth. Sometimes I'm asked why I do not have children. It's a seemingly innocent question, but it is not one that is often asked of my husband. And I hear within it the seed of another question. What is your purpose? We only ever hear of cat ladies, never of cat men. Historically, the temperaments of women were frequently compared with those of felines. Guy de Maupassant wrote that a woman is a perfidious, tricky cat with claws and fangs, an enemy in love who will bite him when she is tired of kisses. In ancient Egypt, the feline goddess Bastet represented fertility and childbirth, and was often depicted with a litter of kittens. These old links between cats and motherhood make sense when you consider the fecundity of the female cat. She can produce as many as 5 litters a year. The kitten looks a little bit like the first cat that was ever truly mine. As a baby, I lived with my parents and 2 cats, Smith and the Minx, in a co-op house that had once been a squat. I can't remember either of them, but suspect that living with them led to my abiding feeling that a home is not truly a home without a cat. When I was 5, some friends from the countryside brought me a tortoiseshell farm kitten. By that stage, Smith had become semi-feral and disappeared. I named the farm kitten Molly, and I would lose her in a similar fashion just 2 years later. For many of us, the death of a beloved animal is our first significant loss. Grief for a pet is also grief for a part of your own life, wrote the critic Sam Leith in an elegy to his cat Henry. I live a stone's throw from where I was born. My neighbourhood is a cat's paradise. They're everywhere, curled up on doorsteps, frolicking in flower beds, gazing sternly out from windows. However, it's also a ruthlessly demarcated badlands that cats must learn to cross while retaining all their limbs. Saving Private Ryan for cats. In summer, when the windows are thrown open, you'll often be yanked from your balmy reverie by a sudden cacophony of yowls. What you're hearing is either a cat fight or a cat versus fox standoff. These altercations rarely end well if the lost cat posters that paper our neighbourhood are anything to go by. My experience of pets and mortality has been extensive. As a child, I had hamsters, which are essentially designed to die. My first hamster, called Jerry, because she was ginger, was mistakenly buried alive by my father while she was hibernating. The biggest loss was Molly. She'd been removed from her territory, and we suspect she died trying to return to it. Cats, like humans, need a stable home. Home has always been important to me. When I left at 18 to go to Paris, I cried for 10 days. The woman whose children I was looking after was bemused at the blotchy, tear-soaked British girl. The emotional outpouring also surprised my mother because I'd skipped off with hardly a second thought. I believe now that I was reeling. Throughout my 20s, my life felt temporary, and I wasn't alone. One friend counted that she had moved 25 times in less than a decade. The newspapers call us Generation Rent. Certainly, we feel rootless, dogged by the possibility of eviction, afraid of the damage a pet could do to our security deposits. It may seem strange to be writing of instability when I've lived in the same place for 10 years, but for most of this time the flat was shared with a parade of friends and strangers. I was also going mad. It's important to mention this. There are better ways of putting it. I was mentally ill, I had post-traumatic stress disorder. You can take your pick. But none of them seemed to properly convey the truth of the matter. When I was 23, a man tried to kill me, and the trauma of that caused a rupture in my brain. Then, at 27, my proximity to the Paris terror attacks prodded the trauma awake, and the madness returned, worse than ever before. I lived in a state of hypervigilance. I felt as though I was an animal, flinching at every small noise. The body remembers and reacts long before the brain, jolting in terror just as it did during its initial onslaught. Even later, in the safety of my own home, I will cry out involuntarily if surprised. When, in lockdown, we brought the kitten home, I came to understand this. The way she startled at the slightest movement, her body readying itself for fight or flight. When we were in our early 20s, my friends and I used to joke about becoming crazy cat ladies. I just want to live alone with my cats, we would moan, having slept with the 3rd, 4th or the 11th man who never called, or who turned out to have a secret baby, or to be one of those guys who did not own a single towel. How do you dry yourself, we'd ask, aghast, to which he'd reply, I drip dry. We gave the vision of the crazy cat lady a certain glamorous sheen. Our cat-owning spinsters were holly-go-lightlies with their cats curled around their necks like living stoles. The crazy cat lady was just a spectre that we joked about. She loomed at a juncture so far in the future as to be unimaginable. As for our fertility, we only thought about it while washing down the morning after pill with our hangovers. It would all be fine. We had so much time. There's a grainy meme showing a crowd of cats assembled on the threshold of someone's front door. Hi, we understand you are 40, it says, and still not married. When one of my colleagues was called a crazy cat lady by a male journalist, she retorted that it was slut-shaming for the over 30s. I was 23 when I met my husband. By the time I found him, I tried all kinds of men. Men who are older, men who are artists, men who quoted philosophy after sex, men who thought Germaine Greer was a man. At least he knows it's a person, my friend said. The one I'm sleeping with probably thinks Greer is a type of cheese. Then a man tried to kill me. He tried to squeeze the life from me, and when he did that, he ruptured my mind and transformed me into a wild thing on the run that either cowers or lashes out when threatened. My need for the safety of home is part of the reason that we are still here in this crumbling rented flat. After my attack, the streets no longer felt safe. I couldn't go back to the house I'd been sharing with friends without being reminded of lying on the pavement with a man's hands around my neck while the other men turned their backs and walked away. So I had to move. I read once that people with PTSD were incapable of experiencing love. Looks like we beat the odds, I joked to my husband not long after we married. But I have found that sometimes, when the familiar symptoms resurrect themselves, I get the sudden urge to bolt. Wouldn't it be nice to have a little thing to look after during this terrible time? I say to my husband when the pandemic strikes. For the first time in years, we have found ourselves without a flatmate. My husband is running out of reasons to say no. Unfortunately, it seems everyone else has had the same idea. Kittens appear and disappear from the listings within seconds. I look into adopting a kitten from a charity, but their list of demands is impossible. Not only do they want to inspect our home, via Zoom, they also want a letter from our landlords. Given that it took 2 years to get them to fix the hole in our bedroom ceiling, obtaining such a letter would be a bureaucratic nightmare. I'm not sure I want children, I used to say in my mid-20s, though what I really meant was that I'd always wanted children, but wasn't sure how I could make it work when my life, career, and mind all felt so unstable. I was also a child carer. My brother has severe autism, and it brought enormous challenges, but what I mostly feel is gratitude. I've known a love so big that you are unsure where to put it all. It's intense and terrifying, almost like grief. There are times when I'm not sure I could take a love that big again, that it would come to dominate all the space that lies within me for the work of writing, just as my brother dominated our chaotic, loving home. He was not like other babies, but I didn't notice. I was a child, but I do remember how beautiful he was. Everybody does. In the end, I find the woman with the kittens on Twitter. I tell my husband that, as a treat, he can choose which kitten we take home. His resistance is crumbling. By this point, he'll do anything, as long as I stop talking. We study the first video we are sent. My husband likes the tortoiseshell one with the flash of white. There's a tiny white tip on her pointy little tail too, and I fall immediately in love. The kitten's mother has rejected her, so provided she is able to eat solids, she'll be ready on Saturday. I look on Google Maps to see where the woman lives. It's out beyond the ring road that circles the city. As we're in a lockdown, we'll need to go on foot. We have bought a cat carrier and lined it with a hand towel. When Molly had kittens, I was told that I was allowed to keep one. I wanted the little black kitten. I'd already decided that I wanted to be a witch. In fact, I had been emitting strong goth vibes since toddlerdom, having caused a furore at my Christian nursery with my pet rubber skeleton, Mary. Witches, of course, were the original crazy cat ladies. Like the Greek goddess Hecate, they were thought to keep familiars, animal spirits that aided them with their magic, most commonly black cats. It was with Christianity that the fear of the witch began to mount. According to the Jungian psychologist Marie-Louise von Franz, the black cat became the dark side to the Mother of God. They were believed to mate with the devil, preventing pregnancy in humans and causing crops to fail. My friend Holly, who now lives in New York, tells me that the cat shelters in America are full of black cats because people don't want a devilish animal in their house. Because of social distancing, the transfer of the kitten takes mere seconds. "Hello, darling," I say to the mewing teacup-sized creature that is placed into our hands. She is frightened and confused. I know instantly that I will do anything for her. She is ours, or rather, we are hers.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat, by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, Episode 2. Summer. In the space of a summer, I've become a crazy cat lady, and I'm not sure how it happened. The first sign comes in May, not long after we bring the kitten home. I've bought a bottle and some kitten milk. I crouch down and feed her until she turns her head away, and then she sleeps, wedged in between my leg and the arm of the sofa. Every morning we open the door to the living room to be met by an extremely happy animal. She immediately approaches us for strokes before spinning around. "The kitten will present you with her anus for inspection," my husband, who has been researching cat behaviour online, reads aloud. Charming. There's a particular blanket on my bed that she loves. She comes in and kneads it with her little paws, purring like the motor in an electric toothbrush, her pointy tail in the air. I decide to buy her another for the sofa, but it turns out they've been discontinued. After much searching online, I locate a second-hand blanket several miles north, and so I set out on foot to collect it. We must serve our fluffy overlords, my father says, of the feline population. He's of the opinion that cats already secretly rule the world, and that most humans are simply too stupid to realise it. Every time I speak to my father on the phone, he likes to update me as to the activities of his 2 cats. Before I had my own cat, I'll admit I did question why he thought I would be interested in yet another anecdote about having to remove a partially gnawed vole from his shoe. Now I lap it up like it's celebrity gossip. I'm trying to remember how old I was when a boy first told me I was crazy. One ex called me some other things, most notably a slut, while throwing a drink in my face, but he never called me crazy. My Parisian ex did, because I can remember how he used to say it in French. T'es folle. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I'd become a writer, and I was familiar enough with the patriarchal notion that all women are batshit hysterics with wandering wombs. The internet men who called me crazy didn't matter to me. They were just words on a screen. 2 years previously, a proper doctor had confirmed my madness anyway. When I first moved into my flat, it was only a few months after my near death on a pavement with a man's hands around my neck. I was suffering episodes of depersonalisation, flashbacks, rage, terror, depression. I was scared to go out once night fell and used to drink for courage. My erratic behaviour didn't seem to turn off men. I spent a blessedly brief time internet dating. Once I went to the pub, in no condition to be meeting anyone. I don't remember much of the date, except that I seemed to spend a fair part of it on the phone to my friend. When my date kissed me, it felt wholly undeserved. After my 3rd or 4th phone call, the man got up to leave. Fair enough, I remember thinking blearily. If I were on a date with me, I would leave too. I finished my drink and ran home. I always used to run home in those days. I was terrified being on the street at night. I was already home when I looked at my phone and saw a couple of missed calls and a message reading, "Where are you?" "You left, so I went home," I replied. "I went to the toilet," he wrote back. He had, it turned out, only been gone for a minute or 2. As the virus spreads and it becomes clear that our global state of emergency is not temporary, we're told to harvest the things that we are thankful for to get us through this long period of hibernation. I make a list. Dancing in the kitchen, a cold martini when it's not quite evening, the smell of lilac. Like everyone, I'm frightened. But I'm also thankful that this has happened now, and not during my 2nd period of PTSD after the Paris attacks. I was in the grip of an anxiety so extreme then that I could hardly leave the house. I became convinced that the world was conspiring to kill me in 1,000 diverse and irrational ways. When I was attacked in London, and later fearing for my life in Paris, my hippocampus, the part of the brain which is responsible for helping us sort the past from the present, was damaged. The past would not stay where it belonged. As a result, the fear associated with the trauma elbowed its way into my everyday life. For a deadly virus and a lockdown to enter this mix at that time would have been a disaster. As it was several years on, so I greeted the news with cheery stoicism. Anxiety can do that to you sometimes. You become such a catastrophist that when a catastrophe actually happens, you feel a surprising calm. On the May morning we go to get the kitten, my husband wakes up, set on a name. "We'll call her Mittens," he says confidently. I protest that Mittens is ridiculous. It's no triviality, a cat's name. Rather, it must be considered gravely from all angles. We discounted the usual suspects. Dictator names such as Chairman Meow were overplayed. The writer Colette had a nice little line in cat names. Fonchette and Mignon were real ones, and Kiki la Doucette and Saha were fictional. Though I appreciated the high camp in these names, they seemed a tad pretentious when used outside of France. In contrast, Doris Lessing's cat names were unappealingly utilitarian. Grey cat, black cat. During our long walk home with the kitten, we traded ideas for names. It was while brainstorming fish that I hit upon mackerel. In a mackerel sky, the clouds make an undulating rippling pattern, like the tortoiseshell coat of a cat. There's a cat called Mackerel in Haruki Murakami's novel The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. Murakami himself once owned a cat by this name. I was ignorant of these facts, being neither a meteorologist nor a fan of Murakami, who I hope writes better cats than he does female characters. Of course, every cat owner knows there's never just one name. T.S. Eliot writes that a cat has 3 different names, but even this seems too slight a number. Over time, his or her name morphs into 100 nicknames, and so she comes to not only be Mackerel, but to also be Little Mac, Big Mac, Puddin, Welsh for pudding, Squirrel, and, while having to suffer the indignities of the vet's Elizabethan collar, Lady Mackerel Cattington. She greets all of these epithets with a resigned dignity that befits her status as the superior being. I loved Mackerel immediately, with the ferocity of a woman who'd been craving a small thing to look after for a long time. I hesitate to buy into the baby substitute theory, but it's true that I am a certain age. And it's true that, despite believing for many years that I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a mother, that I had already spent too much of my life as a carer, the still small voice was crying out for something to love. In Double Negative, a micro-story that wryly summarises this questioning state, Lydia Davis writes, "At a certain point in her life, she realises it's not so much that she wants to have a child as that she does not want not to have a child." To put it another way, I find myself wondering how much of my longing for a child is merely a desire to future-proof my life against possible regret. "But you're a career woman," my mother-in-law said. No one, I have long remarked, ever uses the term career man. This is a woman who has birthed and raised 9 children. "You can do both," I said. "Can you?" she said. It's true that the lack of stability that freelancing brings led me to push my desire to one side. It was my madness that stole several of my most fertile years. I rarely think about the man who tried to strangle me to death when I was 23, except to occasionally reflect on the chain of events that it set off. When I got into my pyjamas and dragged my bruised body beneath the covers that morning, sobbing as I waited for the arrival of both the police and my driving through the night mother, I remember being struck by the thought that this man's violence would ricochet through my 20s in myriad unforeseeable ways. The attack was over, but it also wasn't. The before of my life had been brutalised. I now dwelled in an aftermath. "What was your daughter doing out so late?" the policeman asked my mother. "We meet our unconscious in our own destinies," the terrible therapist said, attributing this maxim to Carl Jung. This was after the Paris attacks, but the terrible therapist, who happened to be a man and was private and paid for by my employer, seemed less interested in the real-life terrorist incident than in exploring the idea that I had somehow subconsciously attracted male violence. It sounded a lot like blame. My mother had a black cat, Dee Dee. Dee Dee had turned up one day during my childhood and refused to leave. At first, we'd assumed he was the cat who'd been stealing our other cat, Jessie's, food. Dee Dee was large and boxy, yet also panther-like. He was the sort of animal who, if glimpsed from far away, might lead you to call your local newspaper with a big cat sighting. I suspect he was a bit of a macho arsehole because Jessie's initial quasi-maternal tolerance of him eventually morphed into loathing, and it was decided that she would go and live with my father, stepmother, and youngest brother. I didn't know that you could love a cat so much. I was aware of the women artists who adored their cats, of Suzanne Valadon, who fed her cats caviar, and of Leonore Feeney, who kept 24 cats as pets. Cat hairs even made their way onto her canvases as they climbed on her easel and palette while she worked. I couldn't predict myself becoming so taken with my own cat that I would end up commissioning a portrait of her a year down the line. I had loved Molly, Jessie and Dee Dee, of course, but these were family cats. As a child, your day-to-day interactions with a cat mostly involve pestering it. With Mackerel, we are all she has in the world. And because our world has contracted this year to mostly encompass these 4 walls and a patch of garden, she is all we have in ours. We resort to Google almost immediately on the question of sleeping. I want her in the bedroom with us, but it's across the flat from her water and litter tray. Plus, the internet seems to think that one of us could roll over in our sleep and squash her. So we put her to bed in the kitchen, with a nice warm box and a light left on so she doesn't get scared. I know that this is the safest thing for her, but the little mews she makes as she stares at me wide-eyed through the door's glass panels break my heart. She's a cat, my husband says. She's a baby cat, I reply. When we first bring her home, she is frightened. I worry that we've taken her from her mother too soon. This is the first of many worries which seem designed to prepare me in some ways for the self-flagellations of motherhood. Should we have slept with her those first few nights? Taken one of her siblings too? She's a cat, my husband repeats. Every time he says it, I hear the unspoken second half of the sentence. She isn't a baby. I know she's not a baby because I'm not insane. No longer insane. She is indeed a cat, but she's also a new soul, an extra presence in our now atomised home, and that changes everything.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat, by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, Episode 3. Summer. At first, lockdown felt like playing house. It was a shockingly beautiful spring, and the sunlight bathed everything in a dreamlike tint. Time took on a hallucinatory feel. I collected posies from the garden and bought a check tablecloth. I practiced my cooking, threw open all the windows. It was, for us, a new domesticity. And in that environment, my desire for a baby, already at times fiercely, irrationally strong, grew inside me. I wouldn't call it domestic bliss. We were given daily death tolls, and the sirens echoed through the birdsong, reminding me again of that night in Paris. It was hardly the time to think of having a child. In a funny way, I was prepared. I've been locked down before. In the months following my return home after the Paris attacks, my anxiety became debilitating. Though it existed mostly in my head, the threat then was greater than any virus. I started avoiding public transport. I stopped going to bars and restaurants, because whenever I tried, I was unable to relax, always keeping one eye on the door as we had that night, wondering if they were coming for us. I still went to work. I walked or took a taxi. I opened and scanned the emails detailing what to do in an active shooter situation, which exits to take. Whenever an alarm went off, I left the building and went home, where I would crawl into bed, hollowed out from the adrenaline. It was during this time that my husband decided I needed a garden. There were 3 plots out the back. Ours was a bramble jungle. He hacked the brambles back and dug up every root. He laid gravel and made flower beds. I planted roses and honeysuckle, scattered meadow seed. It became a sanctuary, a place where I could be outside, but still feel safe. That garden is the grandest gesture of love that I've ever received. In the heat of the lockdown summer, I stand by the open window and watch Raj, our new downstairs neighbour, sitting cross-legged in a patch of evening sunlight. A deeply religious man who owns very little, Raj's first act when he moved in had been to clear his rubbish-strewn portion of the back garden, tending and tilling it until it was a bare patch of earth. All spring and summer he gifts us vegetables that he has grown, courgettes and squash, beetroots, chard. I'm moved by the generosity of this man. When the sickness hit, a hug box appeared in the hallway containing masks, hand sanitizer and tinned foodstuffs. This despite the fact that his work as an interpreter has ceased. The state is helping him with financial support. "I am so grateful to your Queen," he says, one summer morning. I am a strident Republican, but I let it slide. "I'm praying for a child for you," he tells me the next time we speak, and I'm vaguely affronted. What if I don't want a child? What if I were infertile? But it doesn't matter, I think. Let him pray. It makes no difference. Before Raj, our downstairs neighbour had a cat that I'm ashamed to say I really hated. It used to hiss at you when you walked past. It shat in the alleyway down the side of the house with such frequency that you had to dance en pointe to reach the garden unscathed. The cat belonged to Lisa, a woman who could have been anything between the age of 35 and 50, and who you would say had had a hard life. She lived alone apart from the cat, and I suspected that if she'd once had children they'd been removed from her by the care system, a system that may also have failed her. She mostly wore a stained dressing gown and slippers, and hardly went out unless it was to the pub. She didn't give us any trouble, unless you count the tobacco and weed smoke that floated into our flat through a hole in the ceiling, along with the sound of her horrible boyfriend calling her names. I felt mostly sympathy, but sharing a building with her also meant living with a certain level of unease, which hung in the air like the fumes from the rubbish they burned in her backyard. Sometimes in life, you meet people who have been so damaged that they no longer trust human beings at all. A bit like a rescue cat that has been so abused that she flinches each time you come near. You could engage her in conversation, but only in the most cursory of ways. For that reason, we never found out the horrible cat's name. Over the course of the febrile summer, the kitten and I develop a routine. I have started to wake with the bird song. She's always there, waiting near the glass panel of the door, mewing her little mouse call. I open the door and she greets me, purring, rubbing her face all over me. Then I feed her. Would Mademoiselle prefer the minced salmon or the tuna? 3 or 4 times a week I leave to swim. Outdoor swimming facilities have been permitted to open, and I love these dawn walks through the empty streets towards the ponds. I worry about leaving Mackerel on her own, but I soon get used to it. She's safe indoors, I tell myself. I used to believe that bad things happened when you left the house, and sometimes I still feel that old conviction rising to the surface. I have to fight it. 2 agoraphobic women in the same building, one who survived and one who didn't. I'm the one who got better. Why? Mainly through an accident of birth, education, access to treatment, a solid support network, love. Before Lisa died, she disappeared. It became increasingly clear that things had reached crisis point. Representatives from various agencies showed up on the doorstep, asking if we had seen her. Official-looking letters piled up in the hallway. Some of the furniture was removed from her flat and taken to the dump. We wondered if she was being evicted, or if the squalor had become too much. Was she in hospital, or hiding from the law? It turned out that she'd been staying with her sister. One day, she was back. I heard her thin, rasping voice calling out in the garden. "Have you seen my cat?" There had been no one to care for the cat in her absence, and she had told no one that she was going. He'd probably left in search of food. Lisa was near tears. "I'm sorry I haven't," I said. "I hope you find him." It was the last conversation that we had. A month after the kitten comes to live with us, I celebrate my birthday. We lie on a mattress in the shade of a tree and I read. A friend comes to see me. By June, we're permitted visitors in the garden. Later on, my husband puts a cloth on the table in the garden and lights candles. He cooks pasta and we eat in the slightly cool, damp air, just as the sky is beginning to darken. The garden smells of petrichor and garlic. This is why I love him, I think. I'm 33. The next day, I'm unable to get out of bed. The colour has drained from the world entirely. It strikes me that I would be better off dead. I lie there, noticing the feeling. Hello, old friend, I think. It's been a while. I feel, for the first time in my life, old. 2 months after the Paris attacks, when I was still reeling from the terror, we flew to Budapest. In order to board the plane, I had necked 2 large glasses of white wine, along with 2 codeine, and this had resulted in me passing out and needing to be given oxygen by the cabin crew. In some circles, such excess would see me labelled a legend, but I didn't move in those circles. My circle consisted only of a tired and worried husband. For that whole trip, I was a neurotic nightmare. It's for this reason that, one day, we stopped at a souvenir stall and purchased Basil. Basil was a little cross-eyed cat, hand-carved from polished grey stone. He became my talisman. In Japan, beckoning cats, or maneki neko, are considered lucky to the owners. I've never been to Japan, but my husband was raised in a Buddhist household, while my father always used to tell Jehovah's Witnesses that he was Buddhist in order to get them to leave. "I've never seen you meditate," the 9-year-old me pointed out. "I'm meditating now," my father retorted. Basil was not a permanent solution to my issues, which required long-term therapeutic treatment and medication, but he helped by giving me the courage to venture outside. Then, one day, when I no longer needed Basil, he disappeared. Magical thinking only gets you so far. There comes a point where you have to go it alone. Perhaps I will never be a mother at all, I think, in the midst of my deep post-birthday depression. I lie for a week in my bed, contemplating the pointlessness of everything. Sadness is, I reflect, a reasonable reaction to a global pandemic that has taken an untold number of lives and livelihoods, and hoovered up yet another year of my potentially viable eggs. But at the same time, at some level, I feel ridiculous, like a woman in a Victorian novel who takes to her bed. On the first day, Mackerel, who has thus far shown herself to be fairly standoffish in temperament, comes and lies down next to me, kneading the wool of my blanket with her 2 front paws. She remains there for the duration of this low period, even when I cry so loudly that it wakes her up. After a week, I get up and carry on. "It's so sweet," I tell the internet. "I haven't been well, and the cat hasn't left my side the entire time." "She's waiting for you to die so she can eat you," someone replies. There are 2 photos of my brother sleeping that I love. In the first, he is 4 or 5, with scruffy dark hair tousled around his ears. My brother's hand is entwined in the fur behind our cat Jessie's head, the scruff of her neck. Her eyes are half closed. In the second photo, my brother is about 8. This time he is in my mother's bed. His hair is cut short. He is sandwiched between Dee Dee and Jessie curled up on the duvet. In these photographs, my brother looks peaceful. There is no clue as to the whirlwind of chaos that follows him when he is awake. When he is awake, my autistic brother shows little interest in cats or people. It is only now that I'm thinking about motherhood seriously that I begin to understand what it must have been like for my own mother to be told that my brother would never speak or have a normal life. To me, my brother was always my brother. But a mother constructs a life for her child when that child is in the womb. To have that shattered, replaced by something else, doesn't mean that you will love your child any less, but it will be hard and painful. I didn't understand what that meant before. Now my mother's strength feels all the more extraordinary. I fear I do not have it within myself, should something similar happen to me. "Are you clucking?" a friend asked me a year or so ago. I'd never heard those words used before to describe the feeling of wanting a baby. I'm not clucking. At times I am howling. My wanting a baby doesn't feel like a benevolent ruffling of feathers. It feels desperate, like the niggling of a hook or a cat's claws digging themselves into my flesh, somewhere deep within me.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat, by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, Episode 4, Summer. While my friend potty trains her toddlers, we are trying to get Mackerel to shit in the box. We live in a big flat for such a small kitten. The box is a bit of a walk from the living room where she likes to play. When it happens, defecation seems to take her by surprise. She squeaks like a mouse, giving you a few seconds warning, and then carnage. I'm not sure I want children, I say. I've already dealt with enough shit for a lifetime. I'm fairly relaxed when it comes to faeces. With my brother, you had to be. His toilet problems were just another part of living with him and loving him. So when the kitten treads pooey paw prints all over the kitchen, I'm unflustered. My husband, meanwhile, responds with intense disgust. What a baby, I think privately, while I go to retrieve the mop. History is women following behind with the bucket, Alan Bennett has the female teacher complain in his play The History Boys. It's a line I think about a lot, having been schooled in the fundamentals of caring at a relatively young age. You get used to it, I tell my husband. I'll never forget the time I went to visit my brother and his carer greeted us, pale-faced, at the station. "There's been an incident," he said. My heart began to beat like a snare drum. What could it be, I wonder? Did he have a seizure in the pool and nearly drown? Again? Did he dislocate a carer's shoulder? Again? Does he have some new, distressing symptom? It was none of these things. And then he pulled down his trousers, the carer was saying. I surmised that my brother had been caught short in the car park of his local supermarket and had resorted to extreme measures, which had seen him sprint across the tarmac and empty his bowels in the ornamental flower bed. I became inwardly hysterical, partly from relief. I also knew that to maintain my stony facade, I must absolutely, under no circumstances, turn to look at my mother. The terrible therapist told me that it was inappropriate to laugh about the incident in the ornamental flower beds. It's one of the many reasons why I thought he was a terrible therapist. Don't you realise, I wanted to say, that you have to laugh, or else you'd cry? Having to deal with so much poo growing up is probably part of the reason that I've always found glamour intoxicating. It's why I moved to Paris at 18 and embarked on the life of a single girl about town. It's why I saved months' worth of waitressing wages and spent them on a Marc Jacobs blouse. And why I insisted that we all go to drink champagne at the Hemingway bar at the Paris Ritz, even though it cost us the price of 5 drinks in the dive bar we usually went to. A rich girl I went to college with once told a friend of mine that she thought I was in awe of money. She was wrong. Though it's true we didn't have much money once we became a single-parent family, I never really craved cash as much as I did glamour and beauty. I was 13 or 14 when my mother first helped me copy an outfit that I'd seen in Vogue, a pale yellow silk slip from Dior. Glamour is the antithesis of shit. As well as my brother's toilet habits, my mother also had to deal with the cats. "Bloody cat!" she used to yell. "Bloody cat! Bloody cat!" my brother would parrot, laughing with delight. Google search terms May to June 2020. Kitten won't use litter tray. Kitten chirrup noise. Kitten zoomies. The kitten makes me laugh every day. When she's in squirrel mode, she dashes through the house like a creature possessed, making demonic strangled noises while she tries to climb the wood chip wallpaper. She does star jump pounces in mid-air and chases her own tail, never seeming to realise that it's attached to her body. When she purrs, her fur stands on end, brush-like, and her whole body hums. Having her is like having every cat video I've ever seen replaying in my own home. I am beside myself. In the first few weeks, I keep losing her. The flat is relatively large and cluttered, full of little hidey holes. "Where's Mackerel?" I will say, with some alarm, when I've lost sight of her for a few minutes. My husband becomes sick of the question very quickly. The first scare comes one spring afternoon when I enter the sunlit living room only to find her gone. I rush frantically about the house. I'm struggling to breathe. Hurrying back into the living room, my eye settles on the open first-floor window. And I know what has happened. A writer's imagination mixed with an anxiety disorder is a heady cocktail. "You need to relax," my husband says. By the time Mackerel emerges sleepy-eyed from her new lair beneath the record player, I have already pictured her broken little body on the patio below. It has struck me that, if I do have children, I might become an anxious mother. Was I crying only from the fear of losing Mackerel? I don't think so, entirely. This year, mortality has been a simmering, ever-present companion, which I have mostly kept at bay. Sometimes the lid blows off the pot. In The Cat from Hue, war reporter John Lawrence writes of how adopting a Vietnamese cat called Mio gave him respite from the misery of the conflict that surrounded them. "I was affirming a life, however small and insignificant, in the midst of the slaughter," he writes. The cat made him feel safe. It's been 6 months since I last saw my brother, whose care home is in Wales. Of course, you don't stop loving someone because you cannot see them, but the kitten has been right there in front of me. In this strange half-life I've been living, a life without social contact, or the ability to make future plans, she's a reminder that I'm still breathing, that I still have love to give. "Why is it that the kitten tends to avoid coming close to me when I'm on my period?" I ask my husband. "Probably for many of the same reasons that I do," he replies, smiling. I choose to believe that he is joking. It's true that the longing ebbs and flows along with my cycle. Every month just before my period, I become consumed with sadness and fury, mostly at the fact that I am not yet a mother. At other, less hormonal times, I tell myself that I needn't become a mother at all. I am all logic. I watch footage of ambulances queued outside hospitals, and forests burning, and polar bears scavenging through bins for food, and I think it would be an act of madness to bring a child into this. I read an article about the birth strike movement, whose members vow not to bear children due to the severity of the ecological crisis. The founder, Blythe Pepino, tells the journalist that withdrawing her reproductive labour is a very hopeful act. We're politicising that decision and hoping that will give us the chance to change our minds. We watch my friend Holly and her boyfriend get married in a park in Brooklyn through a grainy laptop screen to a soundtrack of buskers jazz in a dress she ordered via next day delivery. The ceremony is presided over by a guy from their street who just happened to be ordained. The guests are scattered, forming a virtual mosaic. The bride's mother wears a fascinator and holds a champagne flute to the ceiling. The bridesmaids are all in London. I'm on the sofa with my husband and my cat. In a perfect New York moment, a drunk wanders into the ceremony. I cry more than I would where I sat in a pew or on a hay bale in a done-up barn. It has the romance of a war marriage, and we've all been made soft this strange, sad year. Everyone seems to have just had a baby or to be pregnant. We joke about contributing photos of mackerel to the constant stream of baby pictures, of countering the anecdotes of new parenthood with our own. Mackerel does that too, just for the pure silly amusement of it. We received the news that our nephew has been born, and are sent a photograph of him, meeting his grandmother through the glass of a living room window. Not long after losing mackerel in the living room, we hear a huge crash and come running. We discern from the mess that she has fallen from a bookcase, followed by a cascade of books and a heavy laptop. The poor kitten has skedaddled, but when she emerges limping, only to lie down quietly, we fear she has seriously hurt herself. I blame myself, of course. I've not done enough to kitten-proof the house. Why was a laptop balancing precariously on top of a pile of books? What kind of incompetent slattern lives like this? My husband is worried, but not overly so. He helps me send a few videos of our limping kitten to the animal hospital, but after that he goes to bed. I insist on sleeping on the floor in the living room, checking my email every 15 minutes to see if the triage vet has responded, until I fall into a fitful doze. When, approaching dawn, the purring kitten jumps down from the sofa to nuzzle my face, I'm overwhelmed with relief. The next day, the vet tells me that nothing is broken, but she is in pain and will need medication. No long-term complications, he reassures me. Except, I think, psychological. From that day onwards, mackerel hardly climbs a thing, and I become more uptight about her welfare. Towards the end of the summer, my mother comes down to take care of mackerel when we go away to Greece. I hug her, despite the risks. I'm uncertain about all of it, the flight, the danger to my mother from getting the train. The kitten takes to her immediately, and this helps. In Greece, I meet cats wherever I go. Cats are legion here. Some have owners, but many do not. People here seem less hung up on demanding loyalty. They understand that a cat is a law unto herself. "What's her name?" I asked the shopkeeper, of the beautiful grey and white tabby that I have just stepped over as she sleeps on the doormat. "Putana," he replies. "Whore." The cat that adopts us for the duration of our stay is called Dali, after Salvador. Salvador Dali loved cats and took his pet ocelot Babu to restaurants. Dali is a cross-eyed Siamese cat. In the baking afternoons, I sit under the jojoba tree to write. There's a view of olive groves, and I have a cold beer, and the only sound is the cacophony of crickets. Dali usually sleeps under my chair or beneath the table, and when he's not sleeping, he's in our apartment, cooling himself on the marble floors. At my request, my mother sends me photos of mackerel. For the first few days, I think of her often, but then I become distracted by other cats. I greet and stroke every one I see. We hire a boat for the day and travel down the coast, swimming in silent coves where the sea is so still and clear you can see to the bottom. The feeling of the ocean on the surface of my skin after so long feels like being kissed all over by some goddess of fortune. How lucky I am, I think, to be here, to know that the world is still turning.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat, by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, Episode 5, Autumn. When I was about 28 and hoping for a marriage proposal, I cooked a recipe from a women's magazine for engagement chicken. According to this magazine, it almost always results in a proposal of marriage. The chicken recipe is not so far removed from the love spells we acted out as little girls, involving apple peel and rose petals and boys' names written on rolled-up strips of paper. Approaching the whirlwind of puberty seemed to make us crave some sort of control, or perhaps it was our growing understanding about power and who held it. My now husband, then boyfriend, isn't even that much of a fan of roast chicken. It's too greasy, and there's far too much deployment of the word carcass involved for an ex, but still wary vegetarian. For a long time, he was as unfazed about marriage as he was about roast chicken. Not that this stopped me from trying. Children of divorce tend to go one of two ways when it comes to marriage. They either avoid it at all costs, or desire it beyond all sense. I was in the latter camp. I wanted the big day, the speeches, the ivory dress that I'd seen in Vogue as a teenager. I wanted a fairy tale, but more than all that, I wanted the stability that had been lost when my parents went their separate ways. A few years after their divorce, I would leave for Paris, and my brother would leave for a care home. Our unit had scattered. I loved this man, and I wanted him to be my family. Maybe I made him feel that we could be a family without children. I never lied. I thought I wanted them, I said, but for several years I oscillated. I turned the decision over and over like a stone in my palm, trying to reconcile that desire for a baby with my fear of becoming a carer again, with my madness, with my desire to write. Go for it, the geneticist said. Holding hands, we walked out of the hospital for children and for future hypothetical children who may or may not have genetic disabilities. The terrible therapist said, "Leave him. He'll never give you what you want." He'd skillfully tapped into a fear of mine, of being the woman who waits too long and loses both the man and motherhood. This was 3 or 4 months after the Paris attacks when, on a street empty of others, we'd realised via a phone call from my mother that there were men shooting people in the area. We had left the restaurant in a haze of wine, having remarked casually that French people seemed more glued to their phones than they had on our last visit. "Faites attention pour vous," the waitress called. When my knees buckled from under me as we raced to find shelter, my husband held me up. I left the therapist instead. I do not like saying goodnight to the kitten. She sits on the other side of the door's glass panel and looks at me as though she is a convict who has been sent down for a long sentence. "Can't we just try her again in our room?" I say to my husband, whining, but he is firm. I have done everything that the internet has told me to do, even streaming a recording of Relaxing Music for Cats, which consists of 15 hours worth of vaguely corporate-sounding piano music. Because Mackerel has the music taste of a junior accountant, it succeeds in soothing her to sleep. But an hour later she'll be awake and nuzzling our faces. My brother has never slept through. Even now he's still a night owl. His carers hear him on the monitor in the early hours, singing softly to himself. We used to sing him to sleep, mostly old songs. Scarborough Fair, Early One Morning, Green Grow the Rushes O. My brother's sleep never lasted. My mother in the next room bore the brunt of this, but throughout our childhoods he would sometimes get into bed with me. I was never annoyed when he did this. My brother is not physically affectionate. As a baby he didn't like being held, and even as an adult when you hug him he turns his face away. In this sense he's a bit like a cat, not so much standoffish as what you might call unneeding. And so, as with a cat, whenever he curled up next to me and went to sleep, it felt as though he were bestowing the highest honour. I had a pregnancy scare when I was just 16. The local doctor had already put the fear of God into me, telling me the contraceptive pill was not enough on its own to prevent conception. Perhaps she decided to scare me because of all the other girls who had passed through her office over the years, girls who saw their futures melt away before their eyes, and girls who'd always known that this was how it would be for them, as it had been for their mothers and grandmothers. All these girls had had to make a choice. I imagine the local doctor thought she was being responsible, was securing for me my future. Exams, university, a career, children in my mid-20s rather than my mid-teens. But the anxiety she created meant that when my period was late, I was petrified. In the car, I asked my father about the effectiveness of condoms. He knew right away what I was getting at. "Don't worry, Poppet. I'll look after the baby and you can go to university." Had I turned out to be pregnant, this is not what would have happened. But it was what I needed to hear. He was saying, essentially, that my life wouldn't be over. My life could have been very different. I could be spending this pandemic in a small cottage, trying to care for my children, possibly alone. Do I feel grateful not to be living this alternative reality? If I'm truly honest, I feel lucky not to be a mother in all this. My school had tried, in a way. But by the time it got around to giving us sex education, we were way beyond needing their rudimentary guidance. Their other strategy was a parenting class. This involved looking after a flower baby, an idea imported from a young adult novel by Anne Fine, which involved drawing a face on a bag of flour, naming it, and taking it with you everywhere you went, as though it were a real baby. The project was meant to teach us about the responsibilities of parenting. But from the look of all the first-year students covered from head to toe in white dust, all it had done was provide us with a new choice of projectile. The school's only serious goth, a girl with multiple piercings who had carved Cradle of Filth into her arm with a compass, baked hers into fairy cakes, which she shared out. The last I heard, the school goth had a thriving cake business, and several children. "I miss Mackerel," my mother says, after their time together. "She's my third child." Throughout this entire pandemic, during the long stretches where he's not been allowed visitors, my brother has asked, "Mum's coming?" And I, on the other side of a screen, will say in response, "Yes, in lots of sleeps." Sleeps are the only measure of time that my brother knows. Ironic, considering he's always done so little of it. After I moved out, my brother's meltdowns became steadily worse and were tied in with obsessional behaviour that eventually left him and my mother unable to leave the house. I've rarely spoken about these particular challenges of caring for him, because, in truth, I hardly think of them. My memories of him revolve around our closeness as siblings. Is this why it's so hard to make people understand that care work is labour? I feel the difficulty lies in the word care. You're supposed to love the recipient of the care that you are giving, and because you feel that love, the work itself is considered natural and therefore not worthy of remuneration and recognition. What do you want? A prize for being a mother? Well, yes, actually. We're told to reproduce for the good of the economy, but to speak of a society in which the work of mothering is structurally supported is frowned upon. I too am guilty of participating in this collective delusion of idealising caring. At times my love for my brother colours everything rose pink. It's true that once he pulled me down the stairs by my hair. It's also true that, after the initial shock, I barely thought of that particular incident at all. I wrote a poem about my brother once when I was a student. I took it to a writing group. There was an older boy there, a philosophy student, whose poems were full of highfalutin references to drugs and modernism. "This is a writer's group, not a therapy session," he said, after I'd read my poem. The message I received that day was the message many women have received over the centuries, that you cannot make good art from the intricacies and complexities of caring. No creative process, no intellectual rigour had gone into the work. You merely excrete it from your feminine brain, just as you expel blood and milk from your feminine body. It is discharge, nothing more. It's October. Mackerel is getting bigger and longer, her fur sleeker, her tail less pointy. She no longer squeaks like a mouse. Soon it will be time to think about having her neutered. During a lockdown conversation with an old university friend, he asks how I've been. I'm fine, I reply, apart from my rapidly depleting eggs. He replies that they are having a baby imminently. The birth rate has plummeted during COVID. One survey found that 60 to 80% of people under 35 living in France, Germany, Italy, Spain and the UK said they were postponing or abandoning the idea of having children. They're calling it a baby bust. You wouldn't know it from talking to everyone I know. There is no year of the cat in the Chinese zodiac because, the legend goes, the cat slept through the meeting between the emperor and the animals and arrived too late to be assigned to the calendar. I booked the appointment for Mackerel to be done. Since dropping Mackerel off first thing, I've been unable to concentrate all day. When the vet calls, I know immediately that it will not be good news. But there is no way that I could have predicted what he says next. Are you sure, he asks, that she hasn't been spayed already? We can't actually find her uterus. The vet finds the cat's womb eventually, but he has to slice her right open. It was, he said, a narrow, shriveled little thing. It happens sometimes, he says. He tells me this as I stand in the doorway in a mask, my face red and blotchy from the cold. Hello, sweetheart, I say, when I'm allowed into the room, a cold slab at its centre. She's wearing her ridiculous cone and mewing in fear or in pain. She must hate us for what we've done to her, I think. I make a bed up on the kitchen floor. For the first few hours, Mackerel tries to remove her cone by dragging it along the floor and bashing her head repeatedly against the furniture. At some point during the night, I start to cry. The whole scene is just so pitiable, and I'm unbearably tired. Eventually, we both sleep, though the floor is hard and my back is aching. When I wake, Mackerel is sleeping encircled in my arms. Dawn is breaking. We have made it through. For breakfast, we'll have eggs.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat, by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, Episode 6. Winter. The cat recovers slowly from her operation. The cone comes off. The angry open wound heals. Happily, my anxiety about her coming to harm lessens as she grows. She's grown too fat to sit on accidentally now, and I'm less worried about putting her through the wash. Has she forgiven me? How long does a cat bear a grudge? It's hard to know. She's less affectionate and happier spending time in other rooms alone. She has found a favoured spot on top of the wardrobe in the spare room, and it's here that she spends her evenings in the dark like a teenage goth. Sometimes I go to her and stand on tiptoes, reaching my hand high up above my head until she lifts her head regally for a stroke. As P.G. Wodehouse wrote, cats, as a class, have never completely got over the snootiness caused by the fact that in ancient Egypt they were worshipped as gods. Really, he should have said goddesses. Shortly before the cat's operation, I'd walked into the city to meet 3 university friends in a park. One had given birth last winter, and this would be the first time that I would meet her daughter. She looked exactly as I would have predicted, like her mother, heart-soaringly beautiful. It was one of those crisp, bright days in late autumn, a first taste of winter. As we walked and chatted, I felt profoundly grateful for the friendship of these women, with whom I spent a year in Italy sitting in squares, drinking bitter red aperitivi and smoking long, slim Eastern European cigarettes. A decade later, we have been there through the twists and turns of one another's lives in ways that I could never have predicted. My friend with the baby girl has long suffered from a debilitating anxiety, and yet she's become a good and loving mother. It gives me hope. The night I was attacked, I'd been with this woman. I'd just recently returned from Italy, where we had become closer. It was an unlikely friendship in so much as she'd grown up in very different circumstances to mine. A multi-floored townhouse not far from the palace, a school attended by princesses. But in the fundamentals we're not so different. We love dancing and Italian literature and have loving families. We'd been to a party in an enormous apartment that had been stripped of furniture. I remember little of the party itself. I suspect my memory of it was obliterated by what happened later that night. Lying on the pavement, a man's hands around my neck, his fingers digging into the flesh of my thighs. After the party, I had taken 2 buses to a poorer part of the city, ignoring my friend's pleas to stay with her. A fateful decision. Somewhere there is another girl. She never went home alone that night. Instead, she walked up the steps of a grand house that used to be an embassy and walked through a marble hallway into a lift. She went up several floors to her friend's bedroom and kicked off her heels, not in order to run down a dark street screaming, but to get into a warm, safe bed. The nights are drawing in, and we are dreading the darkness without the usual compensations of the season. Toasting next to warm fires with friends, red wine, packed pubs with steamed-up windows. On bonfire night, we sit by the fire pit in the garden drinking ginger wine, wrapped in blankets, our neighbours treating us to an intimate fireworks display. We take brisk autumnal walks. I cook bœuf bourguignon with dauphinoise, duck in a plum and ginger sauce. The gourds and pumpkins pile up in the fruit bowl, and we carve faces into some of them to mark Halloween. I buy packs of copper wire twinkle lights and thread them into empty whiskey bottles, which I dot around the house. We just need to shift the atmosphere, I say, at the end of another working day spent trying to avoid the headlines. But it's a challenge, and on some days my little lanterns look like pathetic twee attempts at levity in the darkest days we've ever known. There is no cure, no end in sight. Perhaps it's this new chill in the air that brings Mackerel back to me as I lie in bed reading. She has started curling up next to me again, puddling and purring. It's here that she settles on the 13th of November. For 3 or 4 years after the Paris terrorist attacks, this day never slipped by unnoticed. I would always find myself revisiting the city in my memory, the darkened empty streets, the barricaded bars, running through the quartier past the trucks of soldiers, the sirens. I would avoid thinking about how close we had come. This year, though, I forget the anniversary, yet I spend most of the day in bed with the cat, which I suppose says something. I was 14 when I first saw Paris. My mother took me, though I didn't know how she afforded it at the time. She always seemed to find a way. In my teenage years, I became used to the sight of her calculations on the backs of brown envelopes. Single mothers are financial magicians. Shortly after they were married, my parents had gone there using washing powder coupons. They'd stayed in Montmartre, and their photographs fascinated me as a child. It seemed to be a city of dimly lit bars and rain-soaked cobbles, and my mother and father looking young and very beautiful in their long wool coats and scarves. My mother and I stayed in Montmartre too. We found a classic French sort of hotel, patterned frilled curtains in toile de Jouy, a little pokey entrance under a small glass dome. I loved it. An artist sketched our portraits in soft pencil. Art matters here, I thought. My mother tells me that it was partly funded by a charity for child carers. They taught me to want what I thought I couldn't have. A big life. 4 years after our mother-daughter trip to Paris, I moved there to be an au pair for a family in the 16th arrondissement. Just 18, I walked alone through a tangle of streets on the left bank and was told repeatedly that I was charmante. I'd spent my adolescence assessing myself through male eyes, but it was only in Paris that I was able for the first time to take strength from that gaze. I'd been a sister, a daughter, a carer, and a good student. This was different. In the dusk, I felt drunk with the realization that I had something that men wanted. I walked into a dark bar and ordered a glass of wine. I opened my notebook, and as I sat there, I felt another body hovering against mine. He had his back to me and showed no outward sign of having seen me at all, but I felt it, a frisson. It was a twist of fate that my employment in Paris would be looking after a child who had additional needs. He was a ball of rage. He kicked, bit, and spat at me. Ce n'est pas gentil, I used to say. It's not kind. One of my duties was to make quiche for the children from scratch. It was quiche Lorraine, and I became very good at making it first thing in the morning before picking the children up from school and bringing them home for a full 3-course lunch. Short crust pastry, eggs, gruyère, crème fraîche, milk, lardons. I could make it in my sleep. I did my best. I made the quiche, I picked them up from school. I did this every day, for a room in the servants' attic and €75 a week. I was very unhappy. I'd come to Paris looking for freedom, but found myself instead in a domestic prison with an unhappy child who was crying out for love that I, essentially still a child myself, was unable to give. Furthermore, I found the father creepy. The only shower was in their ensuite, separated from the bedroom where he would lie on the bed by a rubber concertina that was scarcely a door. I would stand behind it, naked and furious. Shortly before I returned home for Christmas, it snowed just as night was falling. They were big, fat flakes coming thick and fast like a blizzard in a storybook, swirling around the lit-up Eiffel Tower and the rooftops. The ridiculous cinematic view served as a reminder that I was in a place where things happened, that there was an existence beyond being this family's miserable quiche-making skivvy. My husband and I have always had a real tree, ever since the first Christmas we were together. I'd advocated for a small tree, mindful that the cat might try and climb it, but as usual we reach the Christmas tree sellers at the local pub car park and my husband is overtaken by excitement. It's as though he has some subconscious rule that the tree has to be taller than he is. He's 6'3", so we always end up with a gigantic pine in the living room. The Christmas I returned home from Paris, there was no tree. My mother hadn't been able to afford one, though she'd made an effort to decorate in other ways, stringing lights around the ceiling beams. We'll just have to find one, I told her. But we'll need a strong man. What are you planning? She looked perturbed. My friend Jacob came down the mountain that evening, so I wouldn't have to walk up alone in the dark. We wore dark clothing, though it scarcely mattered. The track up the mountain is lined by forest and has few landmarks, save that it passes through the middle of an abandoned quarry. I knew this landscape intimately from childhood, which is how I knew that a little further along the road is a paddock containing a number of small pines. Jacob scrambled over the wall and jumped down to the field below. I beamed my torch back and forth like a searchlight. What about this one? Looks great, I said, and he began to saw. I'll never forget the look on my brother's face when Jacob set the tree down in the corner of the living room. "Christmas tree," he said over and over, jumping up and down with excitement. After Jacob left, my mother and I strung it with twinkle lights and baubles so it shone. It remains one of the nicest gifts I've ever received. Since my mother sold my childhood home, the Christmas tree decorations reside in my flat. Her rented place is too small for a tree. Unpacking the ornaments is always a nostalgic exercise, even more so this year. It's coming up to a year since I last saw my brother. My terror of infecting him has kept me away. When it becomes apparent that we won't be able to travel this Christmas or see anyone, my mother sobs down the phone. I'm doing fine, I think. A quiet Christmas in the city. It will be lovely. I'm cooking and listening to Ella and Louie when she starts singing Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, and I find myself winded by the lyrics which speak of separation. I have to take the pan off the heat as I can no longer see the stew. Mackerel spends hours with the tree. She won't climb it, but she sits on the windowsill and rests her front paws in its branches, peering through the needles like a pine marten. She bats the baubles hanging from the bottom branches and sleeps underneath it, curled up next to the trunk. Marooned in the city, we somehow manage to stay cheerful. We drink martinis and play Scrabble. We should enjoy this time together, just the two of us. And Mackerel, of course. Then comes the news of a vaccine. We pop corks. Tears are shed. It is only now that it dawns on me that we have spent many months without a clear end in sight, grappling with a disease with no inoculation or cure. Somehow I have managed to stay sane. As long as you don't count the fact that I've channeled all my difficult emotions into the care of a small, furry cat.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat, by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett. Episode 7. Winter. A month after the Paris terror attacks, my mother came to London for Christmas. My brother was spending the day at my dad's, and my now husband would be going to see his parents and siblings. I was not well. The sound of a helicopter hovering above the house sent me running to the bathroom, where I cowered, curled up on the floor. I was in denial about the PTSD coming back. It's natural to be a bit jittery after a scare like that, I told myself. I just needed to take it easy at home, avoid public transport and bars and restaurants for a little while. Christmas dinner at the local pub with my mother should be manageable, though, I thought. On the day, the atmosphere was as festive as an inn from a Dickens adaptation. A fire roared next to a huge tree, and the bar was full of people who had finished their postprandial walks. As I entered, I made a note of the exits. They would probably come in through the main door and shoot up the bar area first, before moving on to the dining room. It took all my strength to walk over to our table and sit down. I couldn't focus on what my mother was saying. I couldn't move my eyes away from the doors. Bad things happen to me and my family. This was one of my core beliefs. Dr. N, the clinical psychologist, and I identified it in the therapy I was given on the NHS in the aftermath of my attack. I was only supposed to be given 6 sessions, but Dr. N extended it for almost a whole year, and in doing so, saved my life. We discussed how my childhood and my brother's diagnosis may have affected me, how the belief that he would die from a seizure fitted into this worldview that I'd developed. Divorce, my father's diagnosis with MS when I was a teenager, school bullying, all had contributed to this idea that things inevitably fall apart. I suspect had a stranger not tried to strangle me to death, I'd have muddled through life with some minor melancholia. As Eleanor Ferrante writes in Frantumalia, we are tornadoes that pick up fragments with the most varied historical and biological origins. Memories are fragments. The way we remember is never linear. Recollections blend and blur and swirl together. With trauma, establishing order can be vital. Dr. N and I wrote down what happened that night and went over it again and again, adding and embellishing as more detail emerged. The walk across the darkened park, the man asking for a cigarette, the realising there was more of them, the hands around my neck. This is how to file the memory properly, Dr. N said. Then I read it to myself, then to a tape recorder. I listened to my trauma over and over until it ceased to affect me at all. Together we consigned it to the past. I believe that post-traumatic stress is the closest humans come to time travel, and after the long, hard work of therapy, we were able to seal the portal. I boarded the flight back to Paris in early January and wept quietly for the entire journey. I was returning to my Parisian life of childcare and drudgery, school, quiche, ironing, homework, repeat. And while doing this, I was bitten and kicked and insulted. I felt only pity for this child. All the same, he was not my brother. I didn't have love to make up for the harder parts. A couple of weeks later, my friend Shakes arrived for the weekend. She took in the servants' quarters, the terrible pay, the lack of free time, and said, baldly, "Well, this is a bit shit, isn't it?" Things have turned very bad. In the aftermath of festivities, cases of the virus are rising exponentially. Deaths, too. The old fear is back. Outside, everything is grey and flat. I've been working on an article about the mental health toll of the virus on medical staff since March last year. It keeps being pushed back, and each time I've needed to do more research and conduct more interviews. I'm haunted by the things I've been told, how it feels to see the person you are caring for slowly drown while their loved ones watch through a screen. The psychologist I interview tells me that healthcare workers are developing complex PTSD from sustained, repeated exposure to trauma. I'm having nightmares. I want to get these stories on the page and move on. But there has been some good news. My husband is called for his vaccine. It's the first time he's seen his colleagues in almost a year. He sends me a picture of them masked up in the waiting room. I find out that my brother is not on the vaccine priority list, despite being profoundly disabled and living in a care home. No considerations have been made for how difficult he would be to ventilate or keep calm in a hospital setting. When I speak to his care workers, they are in shock. They've already had their vaccinations and are baffled that the residents have not. I spend a week on the phone calling disability charities, public health and politicians. I email my brother's local doctor and ask what they are doing with their spare vaccines. This is what it's like loving a vulnerable person. You have to become a full-time activist. I spent a couple of weeks plotting my departure from Parisian servitude. I've been planning on handing in my notice to Madame in a calm and measured fashion, say goodbye to the boys properly. It didn't happen like that. Apparently I'd used the wrong setting on the iron for the boys' petit bateau polo necks, and they'd become misshapen. She summoned me to their wardrobe so that she could show me, like a person shoving a cat's face in its own mess. They looked the same as before. I explained that I couldn't do this anymore and was told that I would need to leave immediately. Which is how I ended up with all my worldly goods piled up into a shopping trolley, making my way through the fanciest area of Paris to a friend's house to sleep on her floor. The day after my article about trauma is published, it snows and I feel, suddenly, free. Objectively speaking, I'm far from it. The strict lockdown continues, but there is something childishly liberating about snow and how it causes us to abandon our usual dutiful days. Mackerel is fascinated. She sits on the windowsill watching the flakes tumble and fall, not sure what to make of it all. We decide to go up to the heath for a walk. On the way up there, I see an old woman standing at her window, holding up her cat so that the cat can see the flurries. I smile and wave. When we reach the heath, it's as though the fever has gone and the whole city is celebrating. Adults and children pelt each other with snowballs. Crowds are careening down the hill, some on beautiful handmade wooden sledges, and some on tea trays and dustbin lids. In the woodland, the cries of laughter vanish and all is still, the only sound our feet crunching as we walk through the frosted trees. I have seen this landscape in all seasons, but perhaps this is the most beautiful. It is certainly the most fleeting. Soon it will be brown and slushy, its untouched icing sugar surface only a memory. After fleeing my position, I set about finding a new family. I wanted time and space to write and explore Paris, not the half-existence of a kept member of household staff. So I resolved to find an arrangement that traded a room for a certain number of babysitting hours. I scoured the small ads and found Aurélie. I liked Aurélie immediately because her house was a shit tip. She just had another baby, and her apartment wasn't big enough for all of her 6 children, and Aurélie and her husband, Bernard. It was as though a laundry bomb, a toy bomb, a paperwork bomb, and a crockery bomb had all exploded at once. There were children's beds in almost every room, and a rabbit in the kitchen. Aurélie and Bernard lived in what was essentially a cupboard with a platform bed built into it. I fell in love with it, and them, immediately. She explained to me that my duties were simple. On weekdays, I would collect the 3 youngest children from school at around 4 p.m, take them home or to the park, give them a snack, help them with their homework, keep an eye on the older 2 and sometimes the baby, and be done by 6. In exchange, I got my attic room with a separate entrance. I think she thought it was a big ask because she seemed a bit surprised by my emphatic yes. The snow is melting. A friend who works in a hospital says they're vaccinating friends and family with spare doses to avoid waste. The current advice is that any woman who is trying for a baby or is planning to do so should wait for 3 months after her jab. My husband thinks that I should have the injection, but all I can think about is a baby. I walk in circles around the park on the phone to my best friend, who is in between busy hospital shifts. She gently advises me to get immunised, but my desire to be a mother is ravenous and primal. It swallows all logical argument. At the weekend I go down to the hospital, but it's a no-go. You should have come yesterday. It was a free-for-all, the nurse says. Since then they've been told off by management. All the spare doses were to be thrown away. I've been managing well. This is what I tell myself, and I believe it. But it's the darkest part of winter now, and we are all like icebergs stranded from one another, forbidden from meeting indoors. There is nowhere to go and nothing to do. Even the ponds are closed, so my husband is unable to swim through it. I have not known sorrow like this for a long time. Forward momentum feels impossible. Like many others, we are in the grip of inertia. I take to reading poetry every day, a sure sign that I am low. I come across February by Margaret Atwood. It begins, winter, time to eat fat and watch hockey. In the pewter mornings the cat, a black fur sausage with yellow Houdini eyes, jumps up on the bed and tries to get onto my head. It's his way of telling whether or not I'm dead. The sausage cat reminds me of Mackerel, who will not leave me alone when I lie in bed feeling sorry for myself. I never thought that it would be a cat that would help me get through what has, so far, been the loneliest time of my life. Winter is depressing, Atwood, another cat woman, seems to be saying. But take heart, because there will always be cats. Instead of seeing motherhood as an act that will only deprive me of freedom and sanity, I need to find another way of framing it. In the summer, my mother sent me a poem that she'd written when she was pregnant with me. In it, she is walking down a street not far from where I live now, and stops at a fruit stall, where, she writes, the baby chose an orange. She describes it beautifully, as a cold, curved flame weighed in my hands. I imagine her eating it on the pavement, me inside her, and us that, despite our physical distance, has never ceased to be. Finally, we meet. In the freezing park, I cannot hug her, but I stand there holding her hands tightly in mine.
sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Year of the Cat by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, Episode 8. Spring. There was a time when I imagined that I would emerge from this pandemic-enforced isolation like a phoenix from the ashes, glowing and well-rested, with a completed second novel under my arm, and maybe even a baby on the way. Instead, I have enormous bags under my eyes, unruly hair, and a cat on a lead. The reason for the harness is that the cat won't go outside. We'll do it in spring, I said to myself. But now that spring is appearing, it isn't quite going as planned. Every time we put the harness on her, she simply plays dead. Sometimes I see myself from the outside, a childless 30-something freelancer with a cat on a lead that won't cooperate. Well, at least I have the cat, I think. Even if she is an oddball. Who cares? I'm an oddball too. After I found Aurélie, my time in Paris became one of the happiest periods of my life. Outside of childcare, my time was my own. I started writing for an English-language magazine and spent Sundays at the famous Shakespeare and Company bookshop as part of a writers' group. I made friends with poets and authors, went out dancing. Men seemed to kiss me wherever I went. Just over a decade after my year of Parisian freedom came my year of self-imprisonment, 2016, the year after the terrorist attacks. In this way, I understand the cat's mentality. Why go outside when the indoors feels so safe? My social life suffered the year that I was agoraphobic, but I'd learned from my single mother how to make fun in the domestic sphere. She was largely housebound because of my brother's needs and dealt with it by blasting Led Zeppelin, drinking wine and entertaining her other single mother friends at home. It was also the year my husband raised the overgrown patch of brambles and built me a garden. There's a whole world out there, I say to the cat as she shrinks away from the open front door. Outside, the bulbs are coming up and there are buds on the cherry tree. You could be out there chasing butterflies. She's impassive. I won't rush her. I look at the photo of my brother on my bedside table. It's been 15 months now since I've seen his big grin in person. I write to my brother's GP, asking again what they have been doing with their spare doses of vaccine. 2 days later, they phone the care home to say he's on the list. Joy! In Paris, I had no fear. I finished work at the restaurant around 1 a.m. and walked up the Boulevard Saint-Germain or took a detour through the darkened streets around Saint-Sulpice. I never hurried. Then, once, on a dark suburban street, 3 men stopped us and said something in French to my boyfriend at the time that I did not understand. It was only later, when we were safely indoors, that he told me what they had said. Tu veux la faire tourner? Do you want to pass her around? A young woman has been murdered, and the women of London are in mourning and in rage. She was just walking home, as we should all be free to do without fear. I feel the old fury returning, which after my attack was the only thing that allowed me momentum. It was unpalatable, this rage, but it also kept me alive. I wanted to smash up the world and rebuild it piece by piece into a place of safety and warmth for women. It's now over a year since the pandemic started, but the spring is not as we had hoped. It's freezing and sodden. Yet the women come out to lay flowers for their sister and are manhandled by policemen. It was a policeman who murdered her. What was your daughter doing out so late? Don't talk to any strange men, my mother used to say to me before I left the house. From a very young age, I knew there were men who would try to hurt me, that I was to resist if I could. You scream and you kick and you fight, she said, like a cat, dirtily and noisily. And this is how I survived. My mother saved my life. There will have been a moment when she knew that she was going to die, and I cannot stop thinking about it. When the man's hands closed around my neck, my body rushed towards that moment and was pulled back. I was lucky. My husband tells me that I need to detach myself from this case. Perhaps he can sense the old madness returning. I know I can. When I sleep, the nightmares have returned. I think of my younger self walking to the tube on my way out for the evening, red lipstick, of the respectable-looking businessman who muttered under his breath, "Whore mouth." The cat seems to know when I am on edge. She follows me around the house and curls up next to me in bed. I wonder how many of the world's crazy cat ladies have been victims of male violence. Do they identify with the stray, wounded animals they take in? In comparison to men, a cat asks very little of you. It was Aurélie who offered us refuge on the night of the Paris terror attacks, who opened the door when we woke them late by banging on their windows. I've never been a follower of Mary, but a Guinness-loving Parisian mother of 6, I can get behind her. There are images of my own mother too, which glow like icons in my mind. Some of these pictures are sad. My mother crying in the car because the social worker has said, "There's no point teaching him to speak because he'd just talk rubbish anyway." My mother walking me back to the street where I was attacked because I insisted I'd be able to return there, and gently helping me into the car when it became very obvious that I would not. My mother phoning me in tears and saying she felt like a failure because she hadn't had much career success in her life. She could never be a failure. My mother is magnificent. Though it's technically spring, the grey cold feels interminable, and I can feel myself getting very low. My efforts to find small pockets of joy in my days are becoming more strained. You can only fight against a riptide for so long before you start to sink. I'm reading the tarot cards a lot, as I do when I feel lost. My mother always taught me to think of the question when I'm fanning them out with my left hand. I constantly catch myself thinking, baby, baby, baby? But I found the answer to that silent question asked of women in their 30s. What is your purpose? My answer is, to write. The challenge of conveying to others the knotty contradictions I feel around motherhood has kept me going. I plough on, despite all my reservations. My main worry is that one day my child, if I have one, will read what I have written and think, she didn't want me. She'll come home from the playground and say that another child told her that I'd written a book, all about not being sure if I wanted children. I find myself rehearsing what I'll say to her. Mama always wanted you. She was just afraid. We've given up on the harness. It's funny how I have shifted from being secretly pleased that Mackerel does not want to go outside to wanting her to taste freedom. Perhaps I'm recognising that no one should stay at home for this long without social contact. In late March, I crack and take the train north to see my brother. With vaccines, I now pose far less of a risk. The train is eerie in its quietness, and I watch the scenery, flat green fields and blue spring sky, flash past. It's been so long now that the thought of being with him again feels momentous. To stop myself from crying, I think of some of the memories of my brother that have sustained me through our separation. My cherubic brother, at 4 or 5, flooding the house with bathwater and saying to my father, who is bailing frantically, "Want to go swimming?" My brother dancing on his own in the living room, and my mother and I in the doorway, watching, then joining him. When I get off the train, I'm gifted a new memory, a smile big enough to split his face, and a walk together with my mother along the canal. I'm struck by the fact that he's a man now, and how much time has passed. It has been one of the defining experiences of my life loving him, despite all the fear that has come with it. Our friends Ash and Gazelle come over to sit in the garden. My jovial husband keeps offering Gazelle a glass of champagne, despite her repeated refusals. "You can get a taxi," he keeps saying. She is obviously pregnant, but I'm not sure how to signal to him without them seeing. Then she tells us and we all raise our glasses. She is so happy. Later, when we are briefly alone together, I confess my longing to Gazelle. This time I do not qualify it with my list of reasons against. I can only really put this down to this year of the cat. Taking care of Mackerel has taught me that I'm not irrevocably damaged. It has taught me that you can look after someone or something, and that instead of consuming you, it has the potential to inspire. A child has the potential to inspire me even more. And maybe I can start to see my past as a legacy that could help me be a better, more caring parent. A cat is not a baby. I know this. All the same, I've put so much love into this animal. I have wept into her fur. She has allowed me to give voice to all the feelings that I could never have admitted to before, to fear and ambivalence and self-hatred, and above all, a caring impulse that I'd banished from my being. I needed that time. I'm not cured of my fear of motherhood, or of the mental illness that could resurface if I embark upon it, but I've realised that having a child can be an act of hope too. I now feel excitement. Could I really be a mother? The thought makes me want to laugh, and also dance. My husband returns from a visit to his parents and we decide to sit in the garden drinking wine. I'm happy, and when it starts to rain, I'm happier still. We carry on sitting there and drinking, laughing at the weather, getting wetter. Together, grateful, in love. Upstairs, blissfully dry, the cat snoozes on and will until feeding time, when she'll run delighted into my lap, purring, as she always does. Summer. Coda. I stare at the line on the pregnancy test. My hand is shaking. I walk out of the bathroom to where my husband is waiting in the bedroom. "It's positive," I say, weakly. In shock, that afternoon I look at paintings of the Annunciation, searching for ones that feature cats. The Annunciation I find is from 1491, a fresco painted by Giovanni Pietro da Cemo. His Mary bears the angel's news with solemn serenity, her hands clasped together in prayer. At her feet is an hourglass, a pair of amusingly modern-looking high-heeled mules, and a small black kitten. That evening, still in shock, I look again at the black kitten in the painting. Is it intended to represent demonic evil? The black cat seems so sweet and harmless, but then we are told that the devil comes in many guises. There are so many ways of seeing. Brimming with the news of my own personal windfall, I decide to interpret the presence of the little cat another way, as a symbol of luck. An unexpected miracle. A friend. The Year of the Cat was written and read by me, Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett. It was abridged by Julian Wilkinson and produced by Nicola Holloway. The Year of the Cat is a BBC Books production for BBC Sounds.